In 1924, a New Jersey refinery earned the whimsical nickname the House of Butterflies. The name suggests a children's stable, yet the reality was a gothic industrial horror. Inside, burly laborers were seen frantically swatting at empty air, screaming in terror at swarms of non-existent insects before their neurological systems collapsed entirely. The official stance from Standard Oil executives was dismissive, characterizing these men as merely sloppy workers who lacked the fortitude to handle the pressures of the job. This explanation served to insulate corporate conscience, but the underlying data tells a far more sinister story. Decades later, geochemist Claire Patterson attempted to calculate the definitive age of the Earth using uranium-lead dating. He found himself paralyzed by a persistent wall of contamination. Lead was so prevalent in the modern atmosphere that a clean sample was impossible to obtain. His investigation revealed that humanity was not merely living in a polluted world, but within a dense cloud of industrial waste. By the mid-20th century, the lead burden in human bodies had surged to 600 times the levels carried by ancestors in 1910. This chemical saturation invites a reassessment of modern societal struggles. While cultural commentators cite moral decay, the rise of road rage, and a decline in collective patience as symptoms of social media or political breakdown, the answer may be found in human biology. A map of leaded gasoline consumption from the 1970s, overlaid with the violent crime wave of the 1990s, reveals a near-perfect 1.0 correlation. This suggests that the chaos of the late 20th century was not a cultural failure, but a mass chemical lobotomy. Society did not lose its way, it lost its impulse control. As the lead brain generation continues to manage global institutions in 2026, the question arises whether we are witnessing bad intentions or the final bitter harvest of a century of heavy metal poisoning. The timeline of the lead century spans roughly from 1920 to the present day. This era was defined by a central, terrifyingly complex question: how a single chemical additive managed to reshape human history. This choice demonstrably lowered the collective IQ of the Western world, fueled a massive global crime wave, and exposed a catastrophic flaw in the American model of governance compared to systems like those in Japan or China. It is a narrative of biology intertwined with political science, centered on state capacity, the ability of a government to protect its citizens against the profit motives of a corporation. The scene of the crime was the General Motors Research Labs in 1921. As the automobile transitioned from a luxury to a necessity, engineers faced the hurdle of engine knock, a premature detonation that rattled engines and destroyed power. To solve this, Thomas Midgley Jr., a brilliant but tragic chemical engineer, tested thousands of compounds. He eventually reached a fork in the road between two effective anti-knock agents. The first was ethanol, a clean, renewable grain alcohol that any farmer could produce. The second was tetraethyl lead, a synthetic, highly toxic heavy metal compound. General Motors and Standard Oil chose the poison not for its chemistry, but for its patentability. Ethanol, a natural substance, offered no monopoly or proprietary edge. Tetraethyl lead, however, was a complex synthetic that could be owned and licensed. By forming the Ethyl Corporation, these entities secured a license to print money, charging a royalty on every gallon of gasoline sold. They prioritized intellectual property rights over human biology, fully aware of the stakes. Midgley himself suffered from lead poisoning during development, retreating to Florida to recover before returning to mass-produce the very toxin that had sickened him. This calculation led directly to the 1924 House of Butterflies in Bayway, New Jersey. The factory was an environmental disaster where workers handled concentrated lead sludge with almost no protective gear. Lead, a potent neurotoxin that attacks the visual cortex, caused these men to hallucinate swarms of insects, a state they called the phantods, before they succumbed to convulsions and organ failure. 5 men died agonizing deaths. 35 others were left with permanent neurological damage, spending the remainder of their lives in straitjackets. Standard Oil's response was a classic exercise in victim blaming, attributing the massacre to poor personal hygiene rather than the inherent toxicity of their product. In 1925, the U.S. Surgeon General convened a public health conference to determine the future of leaded gas. The fate of the global atmosphere was decided in a single day. Industry-funded scientists argued that the diluted levels of lead in gasoline posed no proven threat to the public, employing the "dose mix the poison" defense. Public health advocates like Alice Hamilton warned that lead is a cumulative toxin that builds up over time, but they lacked the long-term data to counter corporate assertions. The government sided with industry, refusing to stall economic progress based on scientific uncertainty. For the next 50 years, millions of tons of aerosolized lead dust were pumped into the lungs and brains of every child in America. Claire Patterson eventually exposed the scale of this contamination. To obtain a true baseline for his geochemical research, he had to invent the modern clean room, acid washing every surface and filtering the air to escape the lead-saturated environment of the 20th century. His analysis of Greenland ice cores and ocean sediments proved that the average person in 1960 carried a lead burden 600 to 1,000 times higher than pre-industrial humans. Lead is a molecular mimic that the body mistakes for calcium. Because calcium is the fundamental currency of the nervous system, the body actively welcomes lead in, pumping it across the blood-brain barrier and storing it in the bones. Inside the brain, lead gums up the synapses and causes inflammation. It specifically targets the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain responsible for executive function and impulse control, while hyperstimulating the amygdala, the seat of rage and fear. This biological combination takes the brakes off the brain while stomping on the accelerator. Furthermore, lead acts as a ghost in the bone, remaining dormant for decades. When a woman becomes pregnant, her body demineralizes her bones to provide calcium for the fetus, inadvertently flooding the womb with the lead she absorbed as a child. This creates a vicious, multi-generational cycle of poisoning. The sociological impact is quantifiable. A 2022 Duke University study concluded that the American population collectively lost 824 million IQ points due to childhood lead exposure. While the average loss was 2.6 points, children in inner cities or near refineries often lost up to 15 points, the difference between a high school diploma and a lifetime of intellectual struggle. This represents a staggering loss of human capital and trillions of dollars in GDP, all sacrificed to protect a corporate patent. The lead crime hypothesis provides a compelling explanation for the violent crime wave of the late 20th century. Per capita lead consumption peaked in the early 1970s. 20 years later, in the early 1990s, violent crime reached its absolute zenith. As lead was phased out, crime rates began a precipitous global decline. This 20-year lag represents the time it took for lead-poisoned infants to reach their peak crime-committing years. This pattern holds true across Britain, France, Australia, and Canada, suggesting that the super predator era was actually a symptom of environmental neurotoxicity. The eventual ban of leaded gas in 1975 was not driven by public health, but by the invention of the catalytic converter. Because lead rendered these smog-reducing devices inert, the auto industry finally agreed to a phase-out. It took until 1996 to fully ban leaded gas for on-road vehicles in the U.S., a 26-year transition designed to protect refinery profits at the expense of another generation of children. In contrast, Japan responded to lead poisoning concerns at Tokyo's Ushigomiya-Nagicho intersection in 1970 with administrative guidance. The state dictated a timeline for removal, and corporations complied, making Japan the first major nation to ban leaded gas in 1986, a full decade before the U.S. China followed a similar path of state capacity, leapfrogging the problem by mandating a complete elimination of leaded fuel between 2000 and 2009. These nations protected their cognitive infrastructure as a strategic asset, while the American system, slowed by regulatory capture and litigation, allowed its human capital to be degraded. The lead century leaves behind lingering ghosts. Aviation gasoline for small piston engine planes remains the largest source of airborne lead in the U.S. today, often raining neurotoxins down on lower-income communities near municipal airports. Additionally, climate change creates a synergistic nightmare. As extreme heat waves increase, human metabolism changes, making the body more permeable to the lead already present in the environment. Finally, we must consider the lead brain generation currently occupying the highest seats of power. Those born between 1955 and 1980 carry the highest cumulative lead burden in human history. The political rigidity, lack of compromise, and reactive tribalism defining modern discourse may be the biological signature of damaged prefrontal cortices. As this generation eventually retires and the lead clears from the halls of power, there is a biological basis for hope that the collective Western brain may finally come back online. For now, we continue to inhabit the wreckage of a century-long experiment that traded human intelligence for patent royalties.